Hey, thank you everyone for coming. I'm so excited to be here. Big thanks to Apollo for the conference. It's been awesome this week. This is, as a sponsor here, wasn't sure what it was going to be like, but it's been awesome the whole week. So big shout out to everyone who helped put on the conference, as well as everyone in the room and everyone that I've met throughout the time here. So I'm excited to be here because I was not even supposed to give this talk. I'd like to thank my client that was supposed to give this talk, dropped out, and then for some reason said, Dave will do it. So let's find out what I'm actually giving a talk about. How to speed scaling from one to n subgraphs. So my client is a platform team leader at a large enterprise. So I'm sure he put together a lot of topics around how they use tools and automation to speed up this move from 1 to n. So let's see if that's what we're talking about. All right. Oh, yeah, that's right. I forgot. They're in an enterprise. So technology is not the problem that they faced moving to 1 to n. It was people and processes. And maybe I'll get ask a question here. Who here has worked in a large enterprise? And I bet all of you know that a lot of times when you're facing roadblocks as a technology team, a lot of times what you run into is the people that you talk to and the processes that they put in place, and not necessarily the cool nerds that you work with that also want to get things done. Let me ask that same group of people, how many of you had to go through an approval process just to get GraphQL into your workspace? Many of you were just able to use it on your own. It looks like a lot of you had to go through an approval process. Were any of you that used the approval, had to go through an approval process, was it just to do a POC? You couldn't even bring it into prod? Right, so I feel everyone's pain on that. This is a very common thing at many, many enterprises. If you work for an enterprise, you know a lot of times that when you bring in new technology, it's not the technology itself, it's checking all of the boxes, convincing the right stakeholders, just to get that technology in there. And then, as a platform team, a lot of times what you're doing is, then you're starting. So at this point, you've just gotten approval to bring the technology in. So how can graph teams navigate this? We're talking about moving from 1 to n, but you've already gone through this huge process just to bring it in. So I think at this point, it's probably good to kind of talk about what our goals are as a team that's looking to move from 1 to n, eventually looking to move towards federation. So what do we want, and this is something I do with all of my clients, like starting to think forward to where do we want to actually be at the end of this process? Because I think sometimes when we're a platform team on a micro level, we're thinking we just want to get that team to adopt graph. And that's a very okay, they're using graph, but what is the larger goal? So at the end of this, if we're successful, our federated teams are actually contributing the majority of the work to the subgraphs. At the end, they're owning their domain within the graph. And we also have the teams that are consuming. So they're relying on the graph for that consumption. And this also means that our platform team, that we've built this graph for everyone to use, we're actually transitioning not from a building role, but more to a strategy and support and forward-looking role, and a platform team should be, right? And eventually, really what we're talking about is less friction, fewer breaking changes. That's really where we want to be. So I think maybe I didn't start by giving myself an introduction, but I want to make sure kind of everyone knows who I am and how did I get here? Because like I said, I wasn't even supposed to be giving this talk. So I'm David Scott, I'm one of the founders of Duality. This is our first year sponsoring the summit. And I'm also happy to announce that we're also now a delivery solutions partner at Apollo, so that's big. Hoot and holler for me. Woo! Woo! So super excited that hopefully we get to be working with many of you in the future. If you didn't check out Scott's talk on Graph AI and chatbots, it was an absolute banger. Absolutely recommend that you guys check it out when it does get posted online. So at our core, Duality, we are a consulting firm. We are led by technologists. We build ourselves around technologists. And as our chief vibe officer, John, who many of you have probably met in the hallway walking through, would say, we're actually just a bunch of nerds who like building cool stuff. But he doesn't say stuff. So what do you get when you have a bunch of nerds who like graph and they start building a platform within their company? You get a really strong technology focus. And this is great. You're having these conversations, code first, schema first. Maybe we'll use Apollo connections because we're just getting started. What kind of linting rules should we put in place? What automations and tooling should we put in place to help our own platform team deliver faster and at a higher quality? So you have this really strong technology focus that you're working on to build the best product for the enterprise. As a platform team, you're basically there for the enterprise, so that's your customer. So this is an important part of the graph journey. You absolutely need that technology focus. You want to get it right so that when other teams are coming on board later on, you've done the right thing. But you're not just putting the graph in place, you're also building that momentum and excitement that you need to help bring those other teams on board. So there's a catch with this though, because in a large enterprise, your small platform team's enthusiasm isn't going to necessarily translate to other teams. You have to remember that these other teams have their own priorities, right? I think probably many of you who are going through this journey have faced this, where the first time you talk to somebody on another team about adopting graph, it's the first time they've heard that you're using graph within your company. They don't know where you are in the priority list, and a lot of times they're like, you're not on our roadmap. Can we talk about this next quarter or a year from now? And the first time they're hearing about it is when you put that meeting on their calendar. So what do we have to do? All right, we can't expect teams to just stop what they're doing, adopt the graph, and take ownership just because our platform team has selflessly taken on the work and built the platform for them. We're still gonna have teams that go, well, I'm already on this API, I'm already integrated over here, I'm already doing these other things, why do I need to onboard the graph? So to fix this, and one of the things that we really need to do is shift to that customer focus. So this is a part that can be very difficult for platform teams. And again, we start off with our cool nerds that like to build cool stuff. But we need to prepare the platform team for this transition. So this is where we need to make sure that everything that we're doing is getting ready for when we're getting those first teams to adopt, the first subgraphs that we're building, is all about getting those teams ready for their own success. What that means is our platform team becomes the sales team. So we need to begin structuring our platform team to actively manage that transition. So we're going to talk a little bit about what that means and how you actually do that, especially as more engineering tasks move to these teams. So another thing we think a lot about is, and you need to be thinking about as a platform team, is a lot of times how technologies fail within an enterprise. So it's not because somebody from the top didn't say we're doing this a lot of times. Maybe that might be it, but a lot of times it's because the teams on the ground don't actually embrace the technology. So the company puts a lot of money into buying a specific technology or using a specific technology, but what ends up happening is the teams don't end up using it. So it just kind of drifts away. And we don't want that, as platform teams, we don't want that to happen. So this is where that technology focus that I was talking about can become a distraction later on when you're trying to onboard teams. So if our goals are what we were talking about at the beginning, moving from one to N, adoption, federation, and where we want to go, that's why we really need to get out of that technology focus and move towards that customer focus. So we're in the enterprise. Our first challenge is that we have to onboard everyone. So how do we do that? And there's been a bunch of great talks about this so far this week, but it is a challenge that we need to accept. We're not going to just be a platform team and hope that everyone just kind of onboards themselves as quickly as possible, and by the end of the year, everyone's using a graph. We have to remember that most of the teams that we're talking with, they don't have a graph background. We have teams that we're going to be onboarding that we don't work with regularly, so our first meetings with them are just introductory meetings. And we need to make sure that the basics are in place. So we can't just throw it over the wall to them. So this means We need to have basic things in place ready for them to take on. Release automation, things like CI/CD. We need onboarding documentation. We need Slack channel set up. We need to set up workshops. We need to do all of these things kind of proactively. And again, this is all about the customer focus. This is not about the technology that we already built for them. So let me give you a real example. So as I mentioned before, there was another, one of my clients was the one that was going to give this talk. And they brought me in as a release manager, which to me is a very kind of outdated role. But there was a reason that they brought me in. They were a platform team. They had tons of graph expertise on the team. I was basically a generalist inside a team of experts. They were stacked with talent. They had almost every graph person on the team had experience from other companies that built graph, gone federated. And they also had a great product team that had experience with graph. They had testing automation teams. They had L2, L3 teams. They had all of these things that you need in an enterprise to be successful. They were set up for long-term success. So for me coming in, I was like, I don't understand why you need a release manager. They seemed like a well-oiled machine. So I did what you would normally do in a release manager's position. I started to document out what the release process is. And they had CI/CD, they had test automation, they had really low defect rates, they had very strong engineering practices. Basically, they were doing everything right without me getting into the weeds of everything they were doing. But if you have really good eyesight and you look behind me, you might notice that prod isn't in this picture. So I dug deeper. And this is what an enterprise release process looks like. So I'm not here to critique enterprise release processes or anything about the enterprise. Some of these things are in place for a reason. There's compliance issues and things like that, but this is something that the platform team is facing because almost everything on here has nothing to do with graph. The graph team was able to control this bottom 1/6 of this picture right here. And you know, as a graph team, we want to simplify these processes. And when we're thinking about how we're going to get teams to adopt, we have to start thinking about, well, how are we going to, if we can't navigate this ourselves, how are we going to get those other teams to navigate it and be successful? And what this highlights is where pretty much, if this is where our platform team is having struggles, every team that we're trying to bring on to our federation or every new subgraph is going to fall into the same exact issues each time. So how do we overcome this? Again, we can't just expect teams are going to adopt the graph because we solved this little part right here, right? So here's what I've seen in the enterprise a lot of times. Create documentation, send it to the teams. Hey, the enterprise release management team, they know what the release process would be. If you have any questions, reach out to them. We have a Slack channel, reach out to us if you have any questions. And we promise we won't cringe if you ask us a question that we've answered 1,000,000 times. But I think we all know here that's not a winning approach. That's throwing it over the wall and hoping that basically a team is going to do the right thing and adopt the graph. So a lot of things that I've been talking about are table stakes. Yes, you need to have good documentation. You need to have great onboarding guides. You need to have a CI/CD pipeline that can be leveraged by these other teams. That's all table stakes. But the trick, as I keep saying, is adjusting our approach, that this is a customer focus that we're taking now. So we really need to switch to what do our federated teams actually need so that we can get them to onboard. And then we need to, as a platform team, provide it to them. And the success of a federated team in this framework isn't just adopting the graph. That's our success as a platform team. The success of the federated teams is that they're delivering their priorities successfully with the graph. So again, this gets us further into their world as a platform team. And this customer focus, part of this is reducing that onboarding friction. So let's go back to talk about the different steps that we can take. So we're going to talk a little bit about adoption, stewardship, and where we can go from there. So again, adoption. We talked about this already a little bit. We're talking about table stakes here. So we're talking about having those automated release processes that these other teams can actually leverage. We're talking about having great documentation. We're talking about having lines of communications and setting up workshops. But there's another thing that we can do as a platform team to be successful and help speed this up. And those things are on the documentation front. One of the things that we commonly see in the enterprise is enterprises are great at creating documentation. But a lot of times teams make it for themselves. So one of the things that platform teams really need to focus on is creating documentation that is written in a way that if you were onboarding to the graph, what would you want that documentation to look like? That's what you want your documentation to look like. And lines of communication is not just creating a Slack channel or some other channel so that people can reach out to you for questions. You need to proactively be working with these teams, creating ways for them to get involved with the graph community within your enterprise. And you don't want to wait for them to reach out to you. That's a bad model to have, where you have this, reach out to us if you have any questions. That's where you end up in, that team's probably been struggling for a week before they've reached out to you. So you want to be proactively reaching out to them and making sure that people that are going through this process are in a place where they feel like they're getting the support that they need. And then workshops. So similar to this, you have the opportunity to give talks internally, get people to understand what we're doing with the graph. You can hold those workshops. You can perform face-to-face sessions. Workshops doesn't necessarily mean to be the same 2-day session, a 5-day session where you're going to write everything out on a whiteboard, although that's fun, and people that work with me know that I love to write stuff on whiteboards for 3 days straight. But it can be anything from a 15-minute session face-to-face to that week-long session to hash out how you want to do it. But these are all things that are really important as you move one to end. And then there's sort of the next step. So again, adoption is more about table stakes, right? Now let's talk about stewardship and this idea that we have around this. And this is something that we talked a lot about at my client that I was working with, which is, this is where we need to take a step further. This is where that customer focus really comes into play. So one of the things that we talked about doing and got involved in doing is embedding engineers in these teams. We call them stewards, where you're taking someone from the platform team and actually putting them into the federated team. So now they are tied and responsible for making sure that that team is successfully onboarding to the graph, but they're part of that team as well. So they have responsibility to make sure that team is successful as well. But also, what you get out of this is somebody's actually training those teams and helping them along. They are not just someone on the other side of an email or the other side of a chat that's helping them when they need it. They're actually involved and responsible for the success of that team. The document ownership. So again, this is like, to me, I'm like, it's kind of boring, but on an enterprise level, this is really important. Because how many people have read documents that then you read when it was last updated and it's like 10 years ago? This is really important, though, as part of this transition, and this is like, again, to the customer focus, it's like getting your federated teams to the point where you're going, this is you can edit this. It's a wiki page. You have complete access to it. We want you to own this documentation now. You're building a subgraph in your domain, that is your information. And I think that's incredibly important because this is the kind of thing where, as a platform team, it's a lot of times, it's your baby, you built it. But at the same time, you want to give it away because that's what success means within the enterprise. Subgraph channels. So this sort of goes back to the line of communications. If you have been successful as a platform team in creating those lines of communications, not just creating a Slack channel where you're waiting for incoming messages, but creating this community, you want to start to have your subgraph teams, your federated teams, be doing the same exact thing. They're creating it for just their domain, and they're taking ownership of that. And then release ownership as well. So this is a big one, I think, in the enterprise as well, because yes, you've created that, where I showed that thing where the bottom left corner of the screen you have control of, but making sure that these teams control their own processes, because especially within an enterprise, everyone across the board has completely different ways of doing things, even within the same organization. And you want to make sure that they aren't just relying on you as a platform team to figure those things out. And this is where, again, the embedded engineers can really help. These stewards can help move you towards that goal of these teams being on the graph and successful. So I actually struggled with this last slide, whether I should call it automation or something else, because really this is the point where you're successful. You've onboarded these teams. So now what does the platform team do? You're adding automation, you're doing things like that, but really you're getting into that mode of being the strategy, being the consultants, being the strategy experts, forward-looking with the graph. So you're enhancing testing, not just for the platform itself, but you're proactively working with all of these federated teams to enhance their own testing. I have this idea of automating the manual. So I think a lot of people here are probably more on the technical side. I think of this as like more of a product owner kind of thing. There are so many manual steps a lot of times in the enterprise where it's like, you have to put a ticket into ServiceNow, and then somebody opens a ticket, and there's somebody on the other side that you have to email once a week to make sure that they click the button in ServiceNow or some other ticketing service. And thinking about, are there other things that we can do to make it easier for teams to onboard and make the process easier for them, so they're really focused on the graph portion of it and not all of these enterprise layers beyond that. And then solutions for federation. So now you can start to reprioritize work again as a platform team. What are the things that we can do to ensure that we're actually solving for all of these federated teams, for solving for the ability for, and this is where a lot of things that we've been talking about this week at the conference have been around getting these new subgraphs onboarded as quickly as possible. And then the last thing is consulting as a service. So going, as a platform team, getting into that mode where you are the consultants for Graph. You are the strategists, the architects. You are the customer service representatives for the Graph within your enterprise. And you want to become the best Graph support team there is. And I think this is a part where I think this is a mindset change. Because again, you started with this team that you're like, we are engineers, we're hands-on, we want to do this is really great. But this is actually the eventual goal that you want to be at, is that you're sort of in this mode as a platform team where you're supporting all these teams now. So let's talk a little bit about the art of the possible. So if you have been talking to us out in the hallway throughout the week or in side conversations and things like that, one of the things that we think about a lot at Duality is the art of the possible. And one of the things I struggled with throughout this week is Scott and I both gave completely different talks. Scott's talk, if you went to it earlier, was all about the art of the possible with AI, graph, chatbots, and all the amazing things that you can do with it. And if you're a graph team and you've got something where you can say to people internally, we have a super-powered AI chatbot that we can bring to the masses, that's going to create excitement. And it's only exciting if you can actually get it to people. This is, I think, the hard part in the enterprise is, it's one thing, technology is rarely the problem. So you can do that, what Scott was showing earlier today in his demo. And if you want to get it demoed, you can go back to our booth after this. But we also need to recognize that in an enterprise, we need to do all of these other things as well. We need to make sure that we're having that customer focus, that we're reaching out to people, that we're working with them to make sure that they are successful in the work that they're doing, even if it's not purely in this graph space that we are as a platform team. So, thank you everyone for having me. It was great giving this talk, and if you have any questions or want to talk more, visit us at the booth in the hallway. Thank you, everyone.